All right, so, you sent this in, and this is really, really interesting stuff. A summary of Revelation 7 in context with chapter 6 by Brother Donato S. Powell Sr. And, if you've ever kind of felt like Revelation was just like, whoa, so many crazy images and stuff, this study really, I think, does a great job of kind of like bringing us back down to earth and really looking at what chapter 6 and 7 mean, what they're really telling us.
Yeah.
And so we're gonna do a deep dive today on the Four Horsemen and also the sealing of the 144,000.
Right.
And really try to like connect those two chapters and really see what they're saying about how God is acting in human history and how his people fit into that whole picture.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that's really striking when you look at these two chapters side by side is, you have chapter 6, which is just like, bam, these huge forces or unleash these unstoppable forces, it seems like. And then you get to chapter 7, and it's almost like a pause.
Right.
It's like a divine pause, like God hits the pause button. And so you kind of wonder, what is the connection between these two chapters?
Yeah, so let's start with Revelation 6.
Okay.
And the Four Horsemen. And so, you get these vivid images of these riders on horses, and each horse has a different color, right? White, red, black, and pale.
Right.
And the study really makes it clear that these aren't just like random, natural disasters or something.
Yeah.
These represent like forces that are at work throughout human history.
Mm-hmm.
And crucially, they operate under the authority of the Lamb.
Right. That's the key. The text actually specifies that it's the Lamb who is opening the seals.
Right.
He is the one who is initiating these events. And so that, immediately kind of changes how we think about these historical forces.
Right.
Because it suggests that there's this level of divine oversight, even in the midst of what looks like just pure human chaos.
Yeah.
And, and I think the interpretation of that first horseman on the white horse is really interesting.
Yeah. I mean, because a lot of people, at first glance, they think, oh, that's Jesus, right?
Yeah.
But the study, points out some key differences.
Mm-hmm.
And this writer actually seems to represent conquest and political power.
Yeah, more of an earthly power.
Yeah, and the bow that's mentioned is really interesting because it seems to kind of point back to like the Parthians, those mounted archers who were like a thorn in the side of the Roman Empire for so long.
Yeah, exactly.
And so it's more like a form of power that has been permitted rather than the ultimate, victorious return of Christ that we see later on in Revelation 19.
Right.
What do you think about that distinction?
Well, yeah, I think it's fascinating because by contrasting this first writer with the Christ of Revelation 19.11, I think what the study is trying to do is to really get us to think about the nature of earthly power. Like this first writer is really embodying that human desire for dominance.
Yeah.
For expanding political control and influence. And we see this throughout history.
Yeah.
It's this, this recurring pattern.
Right.
And it's independent of any kind of ultimate divine intervention.
Yeah. Yeah. And then the other horsemen follow.
Right.
And each one kind of brings their own form of devastation. The red horse signifying war and bloodshed. The black horse bringing economic hardship and famine.
Right.
And then the pale horse, which is just the specter of death itself. Disease and mortality.
Right.
And it paints a pretty sobering picture of what happens when human ambition is just left unchecked.
It does. And it's important to see that those things are all connected. It's not just like isolated events. Conflict leads to the disruption of economies. Right. Which leads to scarcity, which leads to suffering and death.
Right.
It's this kind of this cycle.
It is.
Of human actions and consequences.
Yeah.
And so the key insight here, I think, is that these aren't just random acts of fate.
Right.
They're actually a reflection of humanity's continued turning away from God. But they still exist within the boundaries of God's ultimate authority.
Right. Yeah. It's not like God's lost control.
Right. Exactly.
Okay. So after this really intense sequence with the Four Horsemen in chapter 6, we get to chapter 7 and there's this big shift.
Right.
And the study calls it a divine pause.
Yes.
Which is a really interesting way to put it.
Yeah, it's like this interlude before the seventh seal is open.
Right.
And we see these four angels and they're holding back the winds of destruction from the four corners of the earth.
Right.
Like everything is just held in suspension.
Yeah.
And that image of the four angels being at the extremities of the earth, I think, really emphasizes the global scale
Right.
of the judgment that's being restrained.
Right.
These winds of destruction. It's like a complete holding back
Right.
of the unfolding wrath.
Yeah.
And this pause is intentional.
Yeah.
It begs the question, what is so significant?
Yeah, why the pause?
That it requires this interruption.
Right. And the answer is that God is sealing his servants.
Exactly.
And before things progress any further, God is marking out a specific group of people. And this sealing isn't like a physical thing,
Right. Not a physical mark.
not like a stamp or a brand or something, it's spiritual.
It's spiritual.
And it signifies divine ownership and protection and identity.
Right. It's God saying, these are mine.
Yeah, these belong to me.
Yeah.
And then we get to this number, 144,000.
Yeah.
And it's drawn from the 12 tribes of Israel, 12,000 from each tribe.
Yeah.
And this is one of those things in Revelation that people, debate and discuss and,
Yeah. It could be a real rabbit hole.
Yeah, yeah. But this study, and I think this aligns with New Testament theology, really points to a symbolic understanding of that number.
Yeah, because as Paul argues in Romans,
Right.
And we see it echoed in Galatians, true Israel is not defined by ethnic lineage alone.
Right.
It's about faith.
Yeah.
It's those who have faith who are the true descendants of Abraham.
Right.
And the church itself is called the Israel of God.
Yeah.
So when we see this 144,000, I think what we're seeing is a representation of the full, complete people of God on earth.
Right.
Those who are marked as his.
Right.
In the midst of all this chaos.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's not necessarily a literal head count. It's more of a symbol.
It's a symbol
of completeness.
Of completeness and divine selection.
Yeah. Yeah. And what's interesting too is the way that the tribes are listed.
Right.
The fact that Dan is missing.
Yeah.
And Joseph is included instead of Ephraim. That's not likely just an oversight.
No, I think there's a theological point being made.
Right.
And the absence of Dan, Dan was associated with idolatry in the Old Testament.
Right.
And so I think that's probably a reason for his omission, as emphasizing the spiritual purity and faithfulness of those who are being sealed.
Right.
And then the inclusion of Joseph, I think, underscores God's enduring promises.
Right.
And blessings to his people.
Yeah. Okay, so when we think about all of this, this dramatic stuff that's happening with the Four Horsemen and then this pause and the sealing, what kind of practical assurance does this sealing offer to believers?
Well, I think it offers a profound assurance in the face of judgment.
Right.
Just as the Israelites were protected during the Passover through the blood of the Lamb,
right,
so too God's people, this spiritual Israel formed through faith in Christ, are sealed by the Lamb who was sacrificed.
Right.
And so this seal, it guarantees their security. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean security from the trials and tribulations of this world.
Right, right.
The forces of the Four Horsemen are still a reality.
Right.
But it's security from ultimate divine wrath
right.
and spiritual destruction.
Yeah, it's almost like a spiritual parallel to the marking in Ezekiel 9.
Yes.
Where the faithful in Jerusalem were marked for preservation before judgment fell on the city. And it's this idea that God preserves his remnant.
Right.
Not always by removing them from hardship,
right,
but by sustaining them through it.
That's a really good connection
Yeah.
to Ezekiel 9, because it highlights this consistent pattern
Right.
in God's actions, protecting the faithful within a context of broader judgment.
Right.
And I think this has direct relevance for us today.
Yeah.
For all of us, living in a world that still experiences, conflict, injustice, death, all those things that those horsemen represent.
Yeah. So how should this understanding of the sealing, how should it shape the way that we live our lives today?
Well, I think it calls us to a few things. First, to live with unwavering faith.
Okay.
And to actively share our beliefs, even in difficult times,
Right.
knowing that our ultimate security is in God.
Okay.
Second, to resist fear that stems just from worldly instability.
Right.
Our deepest security is not found in political peace or economic prosperity,
Right.
but in our identity as God's own.
Right.
And then third, I think to maintain a confident hope, trusting that as God has preserved his people throughout history, he will continue to uphold his church.
Right.
through any trials that come our way.
Yeah, and it really kind of shifts your perspective.
Mhm.
We're not just individuals trying to navigate a chaotic world on our own.
Right.
We're part of this much larger story.
Yeah.
We're part of God's covenant of people.
Mm-hmm.
And that identity is rooted in faith in Christ, not in, any kind of earthly lineage or status.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then I think the study introduces another incredible image here.
Okay.
And that's the image of the great multitude
Right.
in Revelation 7:9 to 17.
Mm-hmm.
This is another piece of the puzzle here.
Okay.
Because while the 144,000 represents the faithful, the church actively engaged here on earth,
Mm-hmm.
this great multitude represents those who have already come through the great tribulation
Right.
and are now glorified in heaven.
Okay, so two distinct groups.
Yeah.
One here and one in glory,
Right. But connected.
but ultimately connected, yes.
Yeah.
They represent different aspects of the same reality.
Mm-hmm.
The unified people of God,
Right.
what the study calls a new Israel.
Right.
Defined not by physical descent, but by the Spirit.
Right.
It's the fulfillment of those Old Testament promises through Christ.
Right.
The Lamb, who is not only the ultimate sacrifice,
Mm-hmm.
but also the shepherd and king.
Right. Who leads and cares for his people.
Yeah. So let's kind of bring it all together now. Revelation 6, presents this kind of stark and often unsettling portrayal of human history,
Right.
marked by conflict and scarcity and death, but all under God's sovereign oversight. And then Revelation 7 steps in and offers this profound assurance that even in the midst of all that, God knows and protects his own
Right.
through this spiritual sealing.
Mm-hmm.
The 144,000 symbolizes the faithful believers here on earth.
Right.
The great multitude represents those who have gone before us into glory.
Mm-hmm.
And together they form one unified people of God, a new Israel.
That's a great summary. And,
Yeah.
And hopefully, for you listening, this deep dive has given you a clear understanding of these really powerful and sometimes challenging passages without feeling overwhelmed.
Yeah.
And these chapters, when examined together, I think they offer this really powerful message
Yeah.
about both the difficult realities of the world we live in
Mm-hmm.
and the unwavering security and ultimate hope for God's people within it.
Yeah. And with that in mind, here's a final point for you to consider.
Okay.
Given this understanding of God's sovereignty, even in the midst of global challenges,
Right.
how might that reshape your perspective on current events
Yeah.
and your own sense of security and purpose?
That's a good question.
What does it actually mean for you to be sealed
Right.
in a world that is still grappling with the forces of conquest and war and economic hardship and death?
Yeah. It's a question worth thinking about.
It is, yeah. Thanks for taking this deep dive with us.
Absolutely.
See you next time.